Narcissism now, narcissism forever. Leader, fan radio network.
Tweet that.
And KFAN.com. 3 minutes, 29 seconds past 3 Central Daylight Saving Time. Welcome back. Better late than never. Bumper to bumper show. Live, local, 3.5 hour extravaganza on an exceedingly Houston-y, very muggy Tuesday afternoon here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. My name is Dan Barrero. I host the program. Guardsy is the producer. Thank you for coming back to see us or listen to us. You can't really see us anymore. For a long time, we had, seemed like, was it a few years? We had a camera.
The webcam.
The webcam. Was there one over my right shoulder that was behind us and another one in front of us, or was it the only one behind us, or was there one by the TV?
We had multiple webcams. There was one behind. There was one, I think, over kind of to your right, over that way.
Okay.
We've had a couple of eras of webcams.
And ultimately, why did we stop? Was it no one? We figured out no one really. It's radio.
Probably.
It's radio. No one was watching.
I'm guessing that's it.
Because I didn't think it was all that expensive to make that available that way, right?
I wouldn't think so.
Is it?
I'm not a great webcam cost mind, but I'm guessing it was. Why do we need them? Nobody really needs to watch us. And do we want them to watch us?
Well, no, I never was comfortable with it, but I was willing to go along if we said, well, that's the next, best thing. That's the new hot thing to do, even though it's radio, that there are people who, for whatever strange reason, would be interested in watching us do a radio show as opposed to listening to us do a radio show. Maybe it'll come back. I'm not sure.
I think it is about to come back at some point.
You're kidding me.
Not like I haven't heard anything, but that's the way of the future. Everything's going visual now. It's easier than ever to see the visuals. So, where I miss it.
Be ready for it.
Well, I would there's a couple of instances I'd love to have the webcam.
Well,
Number one is when somebody says something that we don't agree with,
right?
And we might look at each other or,
smirk.
Yeah, smirk.
Or Kessler might say something.
That we know is going to ignite the Bradshaw and Bryan inbox.
Correct.
Or when Mace is in studio. I think that should be. I've always said that has a physical element that really only I get to appreciate as an outsider in the deal.
I'll give you another example. If we ever had Bill Walton in studio, then it makes sense.
Yeah.
Then it becomes something very different. So I think it has to be.
We've taped those before.
That's true.
On the Final Four, AJ's run a camera and we've run it back because that's another experience.
Special occasions, guests who are especially demonstrative. I think it probably makes some sense. But as far as I know, there's reason to believe we're never going to have another guest in studio for as long as I continue to do this show. That could be 5 years, could be 5 weeks. Who knows?
There may never be a web person in this building again to install the camera.
That's it as well.
It might just be us from here on out.
Sad but true. That is also true. Borton Volvo guest lineup today. It's the birthday boy. Lou Nanne is going to join at 5:15, and I already blew it because Louie called me today on various subjects, and I forgot it was his birthday. I had to be reminded by a couple of listeners. And then I felt doubly bad when Louie immediately retweeted the Rube's capability of remembering when I hadn't, when he called me earlier today, perhaps testing me. For all I know, it was a test. Barrero going to remember this year?
Yeah.
I'm not a good, very, very good birthday rememberer. I'm not proud of it. But in any case, it is his birthday today. Is it 79 today, I think?
I think that's what I saw. I
think if I'm doing the math right, it's 79. He'll join at 5:15. Longtime Minneapolis native Adam Minter is going to join us. He's a big-time author who we've had on the show a number of times over the years, largely to talk about his books, and in some cases about the stories he's written for Bloomberg. And he had an interesting piece via Bloomberg.com that caught my eye over the weekend. I think it was either Friday or Saturday that it was on the Bloomberg site, and he was back here also. I'm not sure. He'll have to update me whether he's back living here or not, because he was in the Far East for a long time.
He's here now because of COVID-19, basically.
Oh, it's a COVID-19
Until
thing.
At least August is what he told me.
Okay, fair enough. And he, I thought, offered up a very instructive history lesson on the great city of Minneapolis, and progressivism, because, as he points out, and a lot of people have, this is a city that, politically speaking, going back really all the way to the 60s, has had a number of very progressive mayors, certainly left of center mayors. And so he tries to reconcile that with the inability to get certain things accomplished, certain things changed, whether you're talking about police misconduct or you're talking about stuff that in some ways is even more fundamental, housing discrimination issues. And I thought it was a good history lesson for what maybe a lot of the kids who are from here might not be aware of. So we'll chat with him at the bottom of the hour as well. I mentioned off the top of the program, we are indeed your something narcissism related. I don't even remember what it was. Narcissism now, narcissism forever leader, because it may be a sub-theme of the show throughout today. And we start with the most obvious, least comical. So to that extent, given the backdrop, the most dangerous example. I'm going to read a tweet to you. You tell me what's wrong with this tweet. It's not important who tweeted it. The thought is what's I think more important. Tell me what is wrong about this tweet. Donald Trump really just had the police fire tear gas and rubber bullets at peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. to clear the streets for a photo op at a church he doesn't attend with a book he's never read that teaches lessons he doesn't preach. Unbelievable.
What's wrong with that tweet?
What's wrong with that tweet?
I don't know. It seems pretty good.
The unbelievable part.
Oh, yeah.
that can never be a part of a tweet about Trump.
That was a trick question.
That's the part of it. That everything else is fine.
Okay.
But unbelievable. Why? He doesn't care about what's happening in this nation. He doesn't. The narcissism in him is just about, I'll show everybody. You think I'm being ripped for being holed up in the White House, right? I'm being savaged.
With the lights off.
For the lights off in a corner, curled up in the fetal position. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to walk from the White House is what I'm going to do to the spot. Has anybody got a Bible? I haven't seen one in a while. Let's see if we can grab a Bible so I can hold it up.
Oh, there's one on the shelf, sir.
Let's just do this. I'll show everybody that I'm afraid. And then he had one of his bobos tweet out, is there any president who has the courage to do what this president did? And, of course, a couple of people point out, well, we've had a couple of pretty courageous presidents in the military. Dwight David Eisenhower might be one, John F. Kennedy, PT 109, and the list goes on and on.
The first Bush.
But I digress. Nothing, no matter, it didn't, if there were aides who had the ability to say to him, Mr. President, this ain't going to help the situation right now. We know you're not a good speech maker, and so the people who are asking you to offer up a speech in which you will unite us all isn't
possible,
conceivable. And so we understand that. That's not in you. And quite frankly, no matter what you said, you'd still get ripped for not saying something else. So we're not asking you to do that. But we're not recommending that you do this. Before a curfew, by the way, right? This was not post-curfew time. Clear out an area of demonstrators who at that point I don't think are causing any kind of meaningful difficulty for only one reason. To give him a chance to get the photography, the photograph that is, I'm assuming, that night giving him an erection. That's the only thing. I mean, and it's not funny because in this case, I'm talking about the kind of narcissism because he's the president of the United States that is dangerous and serious. But it's not unbelievable. The last thing it is unbelievable. If we've learned anything to this point, it has to be that there is no such thing as unbelievable with this president. Adam Minter writes for Bloomberg. He is a Bloomberg opinion columnist. He is also a very accomplished author. We've had him on regarding his books in the past. Junkyard Planet travels in the billion-dollar trash trade. Secondhand travels in the new global garage sale as well. He's kind enough to join us today on the Whiting Clinic LASIK and Cataract Hotline. Adam, welcome back to the program. I was reminded by Guardsy, you are here as in Minnesota, at least until August. Apparently, you kind of got caught up in COVID, the COVID-19 quarantine. Is that correct?
That's pretty much it. My family and I, we flew into the States on March 15th. I was going to do a couple of talks in Arizona and Texas, and as soon as we landed, I turned on my phone. The pandemic had declared. The talks were canceled, and we were in the U.S. It didn't look good to go back to Malaysia, so we headed home to Minnesota. We've been here since mid-March. And
on Saturday morning, as you write in your most recent Bloomberg piece, you took a drive along a 2-mile stretch of Lake Street. What did you see?
Well, I saw something that didn't look like the city that I grew up in. We've all seen the footage. If a window wasn't broken and the store wasn't looted, it was boarded up. There were fires. The whole neighborhood really was smoking, and it was a vision of a city that I didn't expect to find. When I came home from Asia, really for the first extended period of time in 2 decades, it felt more like some of the things that my friends who are war correspondents and trouble correspondents cover, in other parts of the world.
You write very effectively, for a city that's long reveled in flattering profiles of its progressivism, this must trigger a reckoning with its self-image, leadership, and willingness to treat its residents equally. I want to go back and get into some of the history that you lay out, but more broadly speaking, how do we explain that contradiction? When you think of the names that we associate with this state politically, going obviously all the way back to Hubert H. Humphrey, forward to many, many progressive mayors, and you could say at times fairly progressive governors and leaders in other positions, how do we more broadly accept or understand or get a better handle on that contradiction?
Well, I think it's really hard, and I speak as a resident of this place who's done a lot of reflecting, I think like you have and your listeners have, that in many cases throughout the last century, really, the progressivism of Minneapolis and perhaps Minnesota as well has been a progressivism that's benefited its white residents, and that the experience of progressive Minnesota for its African-American residents in particular, but not just, the African-American residents, other people of color, is quite different. And that's not something that just happens. I mean, in many cases it was engineered. In many cases, this progressivism has contributed to, really a culture of structural racism that we're seeing the result of this week.
Let's go back to where you kind of start your history lesson to 1964. Tell me a little bit about the progressive new mayor then, what some of the things that he was proclaiming and how that evolved.
Sure. That was Art Naftalin. He was a very interesting guy, very progressive mayor, had, been connected with the University of Minnesota. He had some big ideas. I mean, he was somebody who believed that, government was almost something that could be computerized, almost like, artificial intelligence. He actually, talked about it in those days. If we just have the right computers, we can make the right policies. And for him, those right policies were progressive. And he very much wanted to lift up the city's African-American community, which had already, suffered, decades of discrimination, everything from economic discrimination to, outright human rights violations. And so that was very important to him.
And as an example of that, you lay out the redlining issue, which of course was an issue or has been an issue in a number of cities. But it's interesting because I do think, again, people here have the kind of the propensity, the tendency to sort of look down on, for example, the entire South and sort of say, well, that's there. That stuff, yeah, that's a different deal. We're Minnesota. Look at what some of our political traditions have been. And yet, as you lay out, and other people have certainly written about this for a while, redlining was rampant in Minneapolis as well. Give the audience who may not even know what the term means, what redlining was about and how it can be so insidious and what it was like in Minneapolis.
Sure. Well, I mean, redlining is very tightly connected, especially in Minneapolis, to something called racial covenants. And I'm sure some of your listeners know what a racial covenant is. It's basically it's something attached to a property deed that says that that property cannot be turned over, cannot be rented, leased, or sold, transferred, conveyed to somebody of a specific race. Those started popping up in the early 20th century in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities in particular. They applied to a range of races and religions. Jews were included in it as well, but primarily they were targeted at keeping African Americans out of certain neighborhoods, either established neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were up. And it was an evil enough. But what happened later, really starting the New Deal, is federal housing administrators basically embraced these racial, and what they would say to a project that wanted federal.
All right, I'm going to put you on hold, Adam. And this is a key part of the conversation. We're kind of losing Adam Minter, kind enough to join us today. He's one of us, by the way, and has been living in the Far East for a long time, but is back here in our COVID-19 winter of discontent, where he grew up. And we're chatting about a piece he wrote for his most recent piece as a Bloomberg opinion columnist. And we're going to give it another shot here. We got kind of a little bit of a connection issue. Adam, let's try again. See, you were talking about where the feds came in to make things even more insidious.
Yeah, so it was evil enough that you have these racial covenants prohibiting, the sale of these buildings to an African American. But then the feds came in during the New Deal. They had these federal mortgage insurance policies, and the feds said, well, look, we want good neighborhoods. And so a good neighborhood means essentially a neighborhood that lacks diversity. And so if you wanted to build a project, a housing project, and you wanted federal backing for it, you had to have racial covenants in that project. And then to take it one step beyond that evil, lenders basically piled in and said, well, look, we're not going to give anybody a federally backed mortgage who's living in essentially a diverse neighborhood, and that would mean, a neighborhood that lacks a racial covenant. So it then extended out from that. Of course, not every neighborhood in the Twin Cities or in the United States had a racial covenant, but you would then get what was called redlining, where you'd have sort of people come and assess neighborhoods and say, well, how many African Americans are living in this neighborhood? Are there any African Americans? And if there were, it would become harder, at least more expensive, to get that federally backed mortgage.
And as you write later in the piece, 2018, Minneapolis becomes the first American city to eliminate single-family zoning, a policy that had, as you wrote, reinforced segregation by rendering entire neighborhoods unaffordable. But as you also say, it was a very significant step, but, words are powerful, and even, you could say, acts like that, in theory, can be powerful, but they aren't going to change things in a minute and a half, which nobody wants to hear, and I understand them not wanting to hear it, but that's the fact, right? That's where this stuff gets really difficult, beyond words, beyond platitudes, is that even if you do the right thing from a legislation standpoint to open the door, it's not going to turn around in 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, let's just back up a few decades. Racial covenants were ruled unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 1948. Redlining has been disappearing. It still occurs, certainly, but it was really started disappearing in the 1970s. But if you look at Minneapolis housing ownership rates, 75%, roughly 75% of white families who live in Minneapolis own their home. Black families, it's around 25%. And that's not just a housing issue, that's a wealth issue, because where do Americans store their wealth? They store it in their housing equity. That's where we store wealth. And so you're not just denying people the chance to live in a certain neighborhood, you're denying them the chance to accumulate wealth and to pass that on. And that persists for decades. And yet, just as you said, Minneapolis took a step in 2018 to, basically allow for the building of multi-unit housing in these single-family, neighborhoods. But that's going to take years, to have any impact whatsoever. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So these are pernicious long-term problems that are going to take, I hope not, but in some cases probably as long as they took to solve.
What happened on the north side in 1967?
So 1967 was the last time we had big race riots in the Twin Cities. The night of the Aquatennial Torchlight Parade, something happened down at the Torchlight Parade. Lots of people disagree with what it is, whatever happened, but basically a lot of young African-American men then came up from Parade Stadium and started rioting along Plymouth Avenue. 3 days of rioting. It took around 600 National Guards troops to actually stop the violence. So it was an absolutely horrible riot. It destroyed what was a thriving commercial district. And if you go down Plymouth Avenue, as I did the other day, you can still see the scars of those riots.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, then Naftalin retires in '69, and the voters of Minneapolis replace him with a law and order guy as well. Do we assume, or is it fair to assume, or is it too dangerous to assume that part of the reason that message spoke to the voters in a so-called progressive town was an aftermath of what took place in '67 as a reaction to it?
Absolutely. The mayor was Charlie Stenvig, and he was a former police lieutenant, I believe in his early 40s. Nobody expected him to win, especially anybody within the political establishment. But he went out there and he campaigned very much as a law and order kind of guy, openly denied the idea that crime could have social causes. It's really a matter of human evil to him. And he triumphed, and he was also reelected, and he lost one of his races, but by and large, he ran the city of Minneapolis mayor's office through the 1970s, and I don't know if a left-right comparison is the way, but he definitely moved it more towards a rightish law and order frame of reference, I guess you could say, during that period.
I'm dating myself again here, and I'm not going to say it's perfectly analogous because you could say politically we're in a very different place, but a lot of people have quoted MLK about, rioting being the voice of the unheard. I think the quote is something like that. But he also said that rioting can also put votes in the hands of or get George Wallace one step closer to winning significant elections. That frustration about what it has historically tended to drive people towards. And I know nationally, there's a lot of discussion about whether that same principle will apply as much as it seemed to going back to the 60s. Do you want to take a stab at that? It's a hard one. It's bigger than here, but it's part of, I think, the concern is, okay, what's the reaction? Mm-hmm. Is there going to be an overreaction to what is taking place now in the streets?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think there's almost no question that Stenvig's election in '69 was definitely a reaction to what had happened in the previous 4 years. And it really wasn't until the late 70s that you saw a progressive mayor elected again in Minneapolis. It sort of took that long, one, for people to feel comfortable, and two, and this is the interesting side of this question, the demographics to change. I mean, Minneapolis in 1969 and Minneapolis in the late 70s was quite different. It had become more progressive in part because it had a larger African-American community that was better organized at that point, so they could push back against that particular kind of populism and bring about a progressive mayor, and that's the real question. The United States is a very different place today than it was in 1968. It's a more progressive place. There's more African American and other people of color voters. They tend to be more engaged, and so the real question is how does this energize that larger population? Is it going to be a repeat of '68 where you have a sort of a Nixon brought in reaction to so much of what was happening in the country at that point? And I will be as fascinated as anybody else to watch. I can't venture a guess.
The other tentacle of this, which you get to later in the piece as well, which we've been talking about for days, is specifically the police part of this issue. And, there's this ongoing frustration about a belief, and I don't know if you can speak to this or not, that there is the notion here that the police union, because especially of its leadership, is more powerful, and in the case of that leadership, more pernicious, and has sort of an outsized influence over all of this. Part of what we got into yesterday is more nationally. There's also the way the courts have handled the old qualified immunity issue as it pertains to police, and whether that needs to be reexamined for all the obvious reasons. What do you know about that part of it, and how big a piece is this? Figuring out whether there's a way to try to challenge the courts on what has been in place previously, or how much of it has to do specifically here with the power that the union seems to wield?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some solutions to this, and I've been surprised that amidst the conversation we've been hearing in Minnesota, that there hasn't been as much talk about the role that the legislature can play in this, and has played in this as well. The legislature is not going to validate the police union or its contracts, but it can certainly step in with certain kinds of reforms, related to transparency of investigations, how quickly a police officer can be interrogated, questioned, all of these things. The legislature is in a position to step in and do this, and we've seen the legislature step in and, depending on how you want to look at it, interfere or reform aspects of the Minneapolis Police Department. Several years ago you had what was called the Stanek Amendment, which allowed city of Minneapolis cops to live outside of the city. That was very controversial. There's a lot of people who believe that contributed to a lot of the problems. Not all of them. There's multifaceted reasons for the problems we have in the city of Minneapolis, but I personally believe having at least some of the cops living in the city certainly helps. And it was the legislature who decided that they didn't have to live in the city. Who controls the legislature? There's only so much the people of Minneapolis can do. Ultimately, you're going to be relying upon voters in suburban areas and outstate areas, and those are primarily white voters, let's face it. And it gets to something actually John Krasinski said during your show yesterday. I was listening. He said ultimately it's going to be, about white folks standing up and saying that, we want to do something about this. It can't just be African Americans standing up and saying they want to do something about it. And so that really, to me, is going to be what's interesting to watch over the coming months and years, is if this changes the minds of, white folks living in the suburbs, if they want to push back on things like, Stanek Amendment, that they've had a role because their representatives voted for it, if they're going to go back to those representatives and say, hey, we want to do something about this. And I just don't know the answer to that yet. It'll be interesting to see.
Adam, I really appreciate the time. It's an excellent piece. We retweeted it, and I heartily recommend it again. Bloomberg.com, Minneapolis's progressive image burns in its streets. The protests over George Floyd's death show how the city failed to fully reckon with decades of segregation. And I think it's really important that you go back into some of the history. And I'm certain you're not the only one who has, but lately this has tended to be we've heard things about structural, and it's been going on for a long time, but I like the way you laid it out. And I think for people who might be a little bit younger, it gives a little insight into just how deep this can go in some ways, how fundamental it is, and how far back it goes. So once again, I good to chat with you. I'm glad you're doing well, and we will we'll try to stay in touch.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you. That's Adam Minter, Bloomberg.com, and perhaps we can even try to link to the piece as well, which I retweeted, I think, on Saturday's program. Bradshaw and Bryant inbox is open. It has been rebooted as a 3 o'clock booth at KFAN.com. Lou Nanne will join us in the 5 o'clock.
Well, she sneaks around the world from India to Carolina. She's a sticky-fingered filcher from Berlin down to Belize. She'll take you for a ride on a slow boat to China. Tell me, where in the world is Lou Nanne?
He is brought to you by NFP Insurance, and I guess I got to start our segment with Louie with an apology. Luigi called me earlier today, and now when I look back on it, I'm beginning to think, Louie, you called as a test. You called me specifically because you had not already heard from me, and you were trying to make it easy for me to remember what I'd forgotten, and then you waited for me to remember, and I didn't remember. And I had to be reminded by listeners who pay more attention to these things than apparently I do, that today's your birthday, and I feel chastened. I feel bad. That I failed your test.
Well, I didn't call you for that because that would have been the first time you ever remembered. So,
yeah, you're right about that, unfortunately.
I almost forgot it was mine myself.
79, if we have the math right, is that correct?
Yes, unfortunately.
Well,
fortunately.
I think it's fortunate, I would say.
Yeah,
All things considered. I mean, you've cheated death about 9 times. You're unbelievable. I mean, you're unstoppable pretty much. You've survived plane crashes. You've survived cancer scares. I mean, you're
drowning accidents.
That's right. Forgot about the drowning accident, for God's sake. Where you that might have been the most harrowing at all. Have you ever told us the near drowning experience? Have you ever told that story on the air?
No, I didn't, and that was the most harrowing. It was 1987, and my wife and I were invited to go visit Gordon Gunn and his wife, who had a place in Nantucket. And Gordon is blind, but he's just a phenomenal swimmer. In fact, for years, he'd just swim along in the ocean. His wife would walk the beach. He'd go down a mile, 2 miles, and back, and she'd just keep saying, too far out, too close,
Sure.
And just guide him by her voice. And he's able to do that in the ocean. And his roommate in college was on the swim team. And when my wife and I were going over there for that vacation, he was there as well. And the next day we got there, Gordon says, come on, we're going to go out climbing on Tuckernuck Islands. Where's that? Well, it's out in the middle of the Atlantic there from Nantucket. So we take a boat and we go out there. And as soon as we get there, there's nothing but a little island and the ocean's roaring and just going crazy. And Gordon, even though he's blind, he just needs voices. He said, come on, we're going for a swim. I said, where? He said, right here. I said, are you kidding? We're in the middle of the ocean. This is where the Andrea Doria sung for crying out loud. And no, it'll define, the current takes you back to shore. So he and I and his former roommate, the swimmer, jump in the ocean. And so we're all swimming. I can't, I don't look up, and I'm just swimming 1,000 miles an hour. And the waves are really high, and it's really roaring, and I'm swimming, and all of a sudden I'm out of breath. I can't go anymore. And the one thing I can't do is tread water. If I tread water, I'll go down like a rock. I'll be dead. I'm drowned. So I look over, and I'm maybe, 75 feet from shore, but I can't get to shore because the current's there. And I look, and there's another 75 feet the other way. Gordon and his friend are talking, treading water. And I yell, help. And I don't get any help. I yell, help again. And there's no help. So now I know I don't
You're
have
on your own.
to do one more help.
Oh,
and so I just talk to myself about, Louis, you were a professional athlete. You were in tough positions. You were in great shape. He said the current's going to take you back. And I kept swimming with the current, talking to myself like this about how I've been in tough situations. I know I can make it. And I just swam and swam and swam. My arms could hardly lift. And all of a sudden my face hits, sand. And my arms are spread out in front of me. My face is in the sand and the water. I can't move, and I'm lying there for about 5 minutes. And next thing you know, somebody steps on my back. And it's Gordon. He says, what's that? I says, it's me. Come on. We'll take a rest. We'll go back in. I said, Gordon, I almost drowned. I said, I can't get up.
Not going back in.
I've never been back in the ocean since.
And that was what year? 87, you said?
1987.
1987. That is scary. Yeah. You've told me that one off air, and I'm glad you mentioned it on air. That is, and I mean,
scary.
I
just get scared talking to you about it again.
Well, what's interesting though is the way you described your ability to sort of summon something where you go, okay, if I panic here, it's over. It's done.
Yeah, Crash. I'm not kidding.
That's a lot.
I can't. I just hate to think what would happen. I don't know how I made it. To this day, I don't know how I made it.
Man, that is. But you stayed out of the water since.
Oh yeah.
I'll
go in pools.
You like pools. You like beaches.
Yeah.
But
no, I don't. I'm not big in beaches either. I don't go back to the beach.
Well, okay.
I never did spend much time on the beach. It's too close to the ocean.
So it stayed. That's 33 years ago. It stayed with you, obviously. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Now I feel bad. I brought it up on your birthday. It seems like you're down. I don't want to beat you down in the dumps about it.
No, I'm not. That tells me I'm still here.
That's it. Great. That's the beauty. It should be another sign of your survival instinct is what it should be.
That was scarier than my plane crash.
Think about
That's a great sentence.
Who else gets to say stuff like that?
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing.
That's right.
By the way, are we what are you hearing from your hockey people on are we have like a 10-game season resumption, a playoffs where we just go right to the finals? Are we going to have nothing? Are we just going to wait for the 2020-21 season? What's the latest? What have you heard?
Well, we're still trying to work it out where they would have an original playoff to have 16 teams in there or whatever, or 24, whatever they're going to do, 24, I guess it is, and then play it down. It's just, to me, it's mind-boggling. They're not going to get started till July. By the time you get all the people over from Europe and Canada, U.S., and et cetera, with the borders closed, and then the COVID, not allowing more than 10 guys, like they're going to have 6 at a time practice.
Yeah.
This is just, I don't know. I just can't get on board with it. I wish I could, but I just think that you got to bite the bullet, take your lumps, and don't in any way discolor the season you got coming up next year. It's unfortunate, but it's unfortunate for everybody that's had their sports leagues and teams, etc., already and will in the near future canceled. I just don't understand. I know there's a lot of loss of money. I know that the owners and teams would like to recoup some of that $2 billion they're going to lose, but so would everybody else, and all the jobs that have been lost, and all the money's been lost in industry, and all the people have lost jobs, etc. This is a tough time, and I think that you have to really protect the sanctity of a league and the schedule and I could see baseball play 50 games. That's fine. I mean, 50 games is a lot of games. I just don't see all of a sudden you throw 24 teams in the playoffs. And you're letting teams in there that essentially they were already selling, they were dead, done, and gone, and they give them an opportunity to win the Stanley Cup. To me, that alone just discolors it.
Well, the other thing that I don't know if what you've heard about this. Let's say they are able to put something together on the fly and have a postseason. Then there's the question of how quickly can you come back for your so-called regular 2020-2021 season, right? I mean, doesn't that complicate matters on the back end a little bit too?
That's why I said it. Yeah. I want to protect the sanctity of the next year, the next season,
right?
Because what they're talking about now, if they go ahead with this, and if they go ahead with the kind of program that they've already discussed, and if you look at how long it's going to take, and then you got to give the players some rest and come back again, the next season might not start till November,
right?
And not that it's bad in hockey because October's not a great month for you still got baseball, you still got football going, and so you got a lot of competition. But it's not the fact that you start in November. It's then when do you end the following year in July? I mean, now we're going to go farther that way, or you're going to cut the season next year again, some games. So I'm concerned. What happens to your farm teams? Do you allow them to start in the American League and the International League, the junior leagues? Are they going to start in October? How's this going to work out? And then if you got some of those players that are under contract you're going to have with you, what do? Put them down in the minors? And so you push everybody farther down the minors? Because if you got guys from the NHL that will eventually play in the NHL, but they're first, second-year players, they can put them in the American League, and the American League starts. You put them in there in October, which means you push guys down to the East Coast League. And then when they come back, now you got to go find players for East Coast League because those other guys, are going to be pulled back to the American League, and the American League guys are going to go in the NHL. I mean, it's really a mixed bag that I'm having a tough time grappling with. I'd rather just see the season start on time and this season be called because they just have too many problems to finish it off.
What do you think the odds are that ends up being what is done, or do you think there's still enough stubbornness that they're going to try to force their way through here?
I'd say 65% are going to try and force their way through here because you're looking at $450 to $500 million
right.
from television rights that would give them some kind of comfort, But the players, they got a lot to say about this, and they don't want to be sort of quarantined in a city or a hotel for how long it takes, 8-10 weeks, maybe to go all the way and away from their families. So there's going to be a lot of things that has to be resolved yet. And I do think that one of the things that players will look at if they get this thing done, they'll get some concessions that they want that NHL will have to give into if they're going to go ahead and play. And some of those being, like, I personally think if the NHL plays, Kaprizov will be playing for the Wild.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
I really thought we were told that the contract, it won't work. I thought we were told that they've already.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, that's where I think the NHL Players Association will push, because if you look back, see it last year, I'm getting McCarr, you probably win the Calder Cup, who came to Colorado playing in college. And the NHL could add players at the end of their junior season, at the end of their college careers, at the end of the European season, before the playoffs. Well, now they're saying, well, it's too late, they can't, that would change the balance again. Well, the Players Association want those guys to be added, because what it does, these guys are going to be able to burn a year in their contract. And that's one of the things that I think the Players Association is going to push for and get if they want to go back and play. So the Wild will benefit by having him play then. They'll get hurt by he's going to burn a year in his contract. But I think for their peace of mind, they don't mind burning a year in the contract knowing that he's already signed. And if the league didn't start till November, the Kaprizov might say, I'm going to go back and just play another year in the KHL.
By the way, so big birthday plans tonight, or are you keeping it kind of low-key?
Low-key, just have our kids over, and we'll have dinner here and just relax here. And, we get together quite a bit as it is, so this is easier to do. The restaurants aren't open and can't go to Tavern 23 tonight, so we'll just sit here and celebrate.
We, on that note, will wish you a very, very happy birthday. I think Guardsy's got something else to throw in.
Not me.
Okay, thank you. It's great talking to you.
Thanks, Doc.
Happy birthday, John Masich. And on June the 2nd, happy birthday, Sweet Lou from the Sioux.
There it is. That's right.
Doc Emmerich, yeah.
Doc with us a couple weeks ago. He remembered it. Yeah, he remembered everything. He's got that encyclopedic memory is what he does.
And still some of your envelopes, apparently, that you sold.
Your envelope. Yeah, that's exactly it. You still have any of those?
And he's got the finger. I got to tell you, this is funny, though. This is... I was selling envelopes before I turned pro when I was sitting out, and I'd sell, whoever I could sell, whenever I could sell. And I sold them to one individual who was really working out of his house, but he had all the necessary equipment to do it. And I sold him thousands and thousands and thousands of envelopes, maybe 300,000-400,000 at least. And so I make the sale, see him, blah, blah, blah. And so about 3 years later, I had now turned pro. I was downtown in the restaurant, and this guy comes up to me. He says, "Remember me?" And I said, I'm looking at him, and I said, "Yeah, the face is familiar." He says, "Louis, I'm so-and-so. I still got some of those envelopes in the garage."
By the way,
he said, I have 5 years left of them.
Who sold envelopes first, you or Harvey McKay?
I worked for Harvey.
Okay, there it is. Yeah.
Harvey came and got me to work for him during this time.
Whatever happened to Harvey? Did it turn out okay for him?
I talked to Harvey this morning.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. In fact, he's my partner. They got a member at Spring Hill, and he called me, and he wants me to play with him. He says he needs one more trophy for 100.
Oh, my God.
So only he could say that.
Oh,
so I'm going to be playing with him. But, he was a pleasure to work for. It was always, Harvey's the consummate businessman, and he's very bright. He's a tremendous salesman. And when I went to work for him, he said, I just started, and he said, "Okay, this is going back to 1964." He said, "Okay, I'm going to pay $550. Your goal in life is to get in commission. You got to sell commission, you'll make more. $5.50 then with money. But he had this thing where it was $5 for a new account, and plus you get commission depending what kind of paper you sold and how much you sold, etc. So he calls me in his office and he gives me all these index cards, about 237 index cards. He says, okay, here's the accounts you call on. Now, every time you get a new account, you put it in, there's a big tub in the center of the office. You put it in there because all the salesmen put their cards in there as to the account they have and they call on and they sell. So I started calling in these 237 companies, and I'd go there. They were out of business, never bought envelopes for 20 years, blah, blah, blah. And I'd look next door, and I'd see a building, and I'd go in and sell them. Or our competitor was Quality Park, so I used to follow their truck around, and I'd see them come off with all these big boxes of envelopes, and I'd start calling on them. So I'm getting these new accounts, and I'm putting them in. I come back, and I put them in the drum, and I think I'm going to get $5 for a new account plus the commission. And inevitably he'd come back and say, no, somebody's already got a card on that. I said, nobody's been there. The people never heard of us. Oh no, they got a card here. They got a card here. That's just the way it is. Well, I took the next week. I didn't go out. I sat in my office. I took the yellow pages from Minneapolis, St. Paul. I went through every account there was, called every building there was. I come back, I had 1,340 cards. I walked in Harvey's office. I said, now the Twin Cities are mine. He said, what do you mean? I said, I've called everybody. I put cards in. So now, you can't do that. I said, oh, yeah, that's the rules. So that's what I did.
Oh, man, that's a good one. Well, good stories added to the mix today. Have a wonderful birthday tonight. You know what you for this show and for me personally mean. So continued good health, knock on wood, and thanks again for all you do for this program, Louie, and have a great birthday tonight.
Thanks, guys. Nice being with you. Take care.
Thanks, Louie.
Thank you.
That is Lou Nanne, brought to you by our friends at NFP.